Hey folks, welcome back to our Dice Tower preview. I'm Mark.
And I'm Randy.
Today we're taking a look at Nexus.
Nexus is brought to you by Devers Publishing. Although there is an RPG version of this in the works, this skirmish version of Nexus plays 2 players, ages 17 and up, and each game takes between 15 and 45 minutes to play, depending upon how fast you bring the hurt to the other player.
Indeed. All right, let's go take our champions that have been genetically engineered into the arena. Devers Publishing has truly created a unique gaming experience here, where they're evolving the game and hoping to make it this huge RPG world with rich history and story-driven gameplay that leads to a battle arena. And each of your champions are known as helots, and you play as a lanista.
Right.
And you are, it puts me in mind of like Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome.
And Master Blaster.
And Master Blaster. It's that kind of thing, right? Where you're sending your champion into battle and trying to basically do all kinds of things, like even throwing them into obstacles that are spikes on the wall that you can pin them up on. Truly a violent game.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons that it's a 17 and older game.
Indeed.
And the fact that you're playing as the lanista, kind of the manager of these helots, allows you to be a little bit more, we'll say, casual in how the helots take damage.
Indeed.
And there are some cases you can actually take damage voluntarily to improve your die rolls.
Now, true to the old style RPG games, pencil and paper games, this game comes complete with these amazing character sheets. And they're really cool because they look like they're pre-filled in a lot of areas. Some of the character types have even special powers that you'll be using throughout the game. And it really doesn't matter about what your character is on the board. It's all about which one you've chosen for your sheet.
Exactly. Now, each of these characters, there's a character class, but in Nexus they're called motivations. And so for each of these character types, you'll have a unique character sheet or motivation sheet that tells you which dice you roll for each different type of attack. Now, there are various types of attacks, and they require action points. We'll talk about that in a moment.
And everybody's are different.
Everybody's different, right.
And the dice they use are different.
Right.
It's pretty creative, actually.
So you might have one motivation, one character that uses just a D12 for an attack, and I might get a D8 and a D10.
Right.
And so it varies from motivation to motivation. Now, as you play the game, this sheet helps you keep track of the damage you take, as well as any sort of bonuses you get. And what this does is, as you take damage, as you have wounds and things like that, the dice you roll for the different types of attacks and the dice you roll for defenses degrade.
Yes, it's on a sliding scale.
Exactly, and it's what they call the sliding dice scale here, right there. So you might go from a D12 to a D10 down to a D8 and so forth.
It's pretty clever, actually.
It is.
And the reference sheet for it is really handy, and the more wounds you take, the less your dice are effective, and so forth. So.
And as you pick up things like weapons, or you position yourself appropriately, your sliding dice scale goes up. So there are ways to both move it up and move it down.
Now, in this arena, in this skirmish mode, one of the main things you're going to be doing at the start of your turn is rolling a 6-sided dice to determine how many action points you can actually spend on your turn. And these action points will allow you to do things like attacking and moving. And a couple of things to note are that the different attacks and different moves require different point totals. So like a focused attack is very expensive. It requires 3 points. And like moving backward, which I love, it requires 2 points of action points, because you got to be careful about moving back. You want to step on something or step over something. So it's really interesting how those actions come into play and what points you can actually spend on them on your turn. You might only get like a 1, so you have to do a wild attack and hope it hits, right?
Now, yes, and so you might say, I'm just going to do a wild attack, and that hits everything almost within 180 degrees, but you have to take a point of damage yourself.
Indeed.
Now, you have an alternative, as I mentioned before, that if you get a poor roll, you can take 5 points of damage to your overall health and actually make that up to 6 action points to spend. So you have those choices. And I said, as a lanista, you don't feel the pain yourself.
Indeed.
But there are a variety of attacks you can perform at various costs, and the more you spend, chances are the more damage you're going to do as well.
Right.
Now, we haven't mentioned yet the fact that when you're doing damage, you have the ability sometimes to do damage just to the overall health. And you see on this action, or on the motivation sheet, you have your overall health here at the top, but you also have specific areas of the body. So if you're doing something like a wild attack, you're just hitting wildly, and you're only damaging up here, the overall point value. But when you do damage to a specific area of the body,
like a focused attack.
Yeah, you can sometimes you can specify, and other times you don't. And you just roll a die to determine where you hit.
Right.
But when you do damage to a location here, you do it to that location as well as to your overall health, or to the opponent's overall health. And then once that location has hit a specific threshold, then you start incurring penalties. The sliding dice scale moves down.
Comes into play.
And it can have long-term effects both on your defense rolls as well as your attack rolls. Now, before you perform an attack, something you might want to do, Mark mentioned moving, so it's not just attacking, because if you move to the correct location, for example, if you flank someone on their side, you actually, when you attack, you get to move your sliding die scale up by 1. And if you move around behind them, you actually get to move your sliding die scale up by 2.
So positioning is very important.
It is. So if you can have enough points to both move and attack, that's the right way to go.
Indeed. The other thing to note is that when you roll your action dice to find out how many points you have, then you're going to be placing coins into slots.
For the action, when you first roll your action point dice.
Yes. And what you're trying to look out for here is once you have more than 3 coins.
When you have 3 and when you have 6.
And 6. Then you're going to pull a turning point card.
And we're going to tell you about that in a second, because it's pretty darn cool. Because,
it is, indeed.
Because what's a deathmatch arena without death traps? So come back to that in a moment. Now, one specific type of action you can spend points on is the grapple action. And what this does is it does, and it's either wrapping arms around them, or catching them in a net, or catching them in a chain, or something like that. But at that point in time, they don't move easily.
Right.
And that opens up a variety of other attacks you can do, and they're called crush, drag, takedown, and throw. Now, these are pretty much what you'd expect them to be.
Indeed.
But 2 of those, crush and drag, do just standard damage, but throw and takedown changes their status from grappled to prone. You're basically either throwing them to the ground or throwing them across the room.
Yeah.
And in both of those, they're no longer grappled, but they're still prone, so they're in a state of disadvantage.
And what's interesting is that the way you keep track of that in both grappled state and prone state is there's cards that you'll be flipping over on your side of the table to show what state you are in, because it's hard to tell on the board, particularly how you're doing it, right? I mean, you can lay guys down and so forth, but to be thematic about it. But these cards are really how you're going to keep track of what position you're in currently. And there are ways to get out of being grappled.
Right.
And of course, prone, you would use a movement action to stand back up.
Right.
Now, but if you're grappled, you're going to be rolling against your opponent's crush ability, or his crush action, so to say, to try to liberate yourself from that grapple.
Right. So there's a lot of pros and cons. In fact, you might say, well, instead of trying to get him or do a massive attack right now, I'm going to try to grapple him and put him at a disadvantage. And so he's going to have to spend points on trying to liberate himself in future turns. So there's that trade-off. Do I go for direct damage, or do I try to put him in a state of disadvantage?
And it's really super thematic. All the actions, all the movements, and the grapple particularly, it's just really engaging, especially with all the environment and all the things you have to try to avoid.
That's right.
All right, now let's take a look at some hazards, because that's kind of the heart of this battlefield.
It is.
There's all kinds of traps and terrible things happening out here. And what happens is that, maybe not typically you're going to put all of these hazards
that
on
would
the
just
board.
be suicide.
It would be suicide, right? But we put them all out here to kind of show you what they look like. But there's things like the floor saw, there's floor spikes, radioactive waste barrels, there's weapon crates, which are awesome because that's where you get your weapon card.
Yeah, if you destroy the crate, then you might find a weapon under there.
And there's some really interesting weapons in that deck. There's dart columns, which basically reduce your dice down to almost nothing if you keep getting hit with these darts.
Yeah, if you keep getting poisoned.
And they're poisoned, there's wall spikes. Again, wall spikes you're throwing people up against. What I find interesting, though, is the floor saws, because you roll directional dice for these saws, and they're going to zip across the board. And so you don't know exactly where they're going to end up.
on wherever I'm at, that's where they're going to end up. We found that out in a previous game.
Indeed. But they literally just zip across the board, and then they can have impacts that they shatter everywhere as well.
And so, anybody in the blast radius can take damage.
Yeah, so it's pretty interesting how these traps and how they behave throughout the game. So I really find that adds a lot of flavor to these combat.
Yeah, and so the game comes with these death traps and these hazards. And at the beginning of the game, you and your opponent get to choose. You could put some out randomly if you wanted to, or you can choose and say, this time we're going to deal with the dark columns and the braziers or something like that.
Yep, and the placement can be whatever you want too. And that's where, the game kind of has a sandboxy feel to it, where it's really up to you and your opponent how you want to set up this environment.
Now, some of these traps are always in effect. Like the radiation barrel is always a danger if you get anywhere in the vicinity of it and you take damage. But others of these, like the floor saws, pop up and go spinning across the arena only at certain times.
Right.
And this is where what we talked about with these midpoints, the turning points rather, the mid-turning point and the end-turning point come into play. When you're rolling your action die, you are putting these coins down at the value of that die. So if you rolled a 6, you put a coin in the 6 if there wasn't one there already. And one of the sides of the frame here is for you and the other one is for your opponent. Whenever one of the sides gets 3 coins in 3 of the slots, meaning you've rolled half of the possible numbers on the die, it triggers one of these turning points. Now, what happens during a turning point is that some of these hazards get activated. And maybe it's possible that the ones you've chosen don't get activated at turning points. But if there are any out there that do get activated, that's when they come into effect.
Indeed.
Now, in addition to the hazards themselves, you have these things called turning point cards, which can make a bad day even worse.
Indeed. And they're environmental effects a lot of the time.
They are. Sometimes they affect everybody. So, for example, if flickering lights come into play during a turning point, it reduces the number of action points that you rolled by 1 until the next turning point occurs. So if you've been rolling 1s a lot, that reduces it down to 0. You don't even get to do a wild attack at that point. Some of them attack or impact only one player, maybe you, maybe the other player. And the you is whoever added that 3rd or 6th coin to their side. This one, the Mischief of Rats, doesn't impact you if you're the one who triggered the turning point. It actually impacts your opponent. And these do 2 damage to each of the lower appendages and 4 to your overall health. So very bad thing.
Now, at the start of the game, everyone's going to get some influence cards. And basically these are special instant actions or special abilities that only you will have during the game. They're one-time use. So they do all kinds of different things and they trigger at different points throughout the game. Some trigger on your actions, some will trigger when at any point in the game. But there's things like giving you extra movement, feats of fancy, and there's like disarming your opponent, getting rid of one of their powerful weapons. So there's really a lot of different things that these cards can do, and the strategic value is quite high and holding on to them till the right point in the game.
Right. Some of them are offensive, some of them are defensive, and it does create quite a bit of replayability.
It does.
It also makes you realize that, I'm getting ready to do this massive attack, and he's got this face down influence card, so maybe I should wait till he's played that, because it might, I think there's one that reverses damage.
There is, and there's one that even makes your opponent show their influence cards.
So this adds an additional dimension to the gameplay, because even if you're in the same position you've been in before, the influence cards can make it a very different experience.
So play continues very much like this, back and forth, tug of war, avoiding obstacles, using obstacles, to reduce your opponent to 0 health.
Now, killing your opponent can take on one of 2 forms, either reducing their overall health to 0, or by reducing the health of their head or their chest to -5. So they could still be up in the 20s or 30s.
Yeah, indeed.
But if you've decapitated them entirely, it's over.
All right, folks, just a reminder once again, this has been a Dice Tower paid preview, and everything you've seen here has been in prototype form. So keep a close eye on the campaign for any changes that still may occur. Now, with that said, our version of this game is the high-end, painted, beautiful version of the game. And it really, I have to say, it really does add to the gameplay and the thematic nature to have all of this painted. And it looks just, the table presence is phenomenal. And you know, it is again important to note that this does have some adult content in this game. This game is definitely not for kids.
Yeah, and it's not just the violence inherent in the game itself or the violence inherent in the system.
Yeah, indeed.
But there are also cards, as well as the manual itself. It has some adult images. But now it's nothing hard R or anything like that.
Nothing
But
like that.
yeah, but it's not something you're going to want to play with your 8-year-old kid.
Indeed. And you know, the history and the story behind this game and the RPG value, I'm excited to see where they take that, because they have a rich world that this could really turn into.
Yeah.
So folks, ultimately, if this looks like something you would find interesting, I'm sure they would appreciate your support.
Absolutely.
So I think that's it from us.
Yep.
And until next time, we'll see you at the table.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews, as well as our top-rated audio podcast at dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at dicetowernetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff in stock. Check them out at coolstuffinc.com.